The sun dipped low over the wide plains of Red River Valley, painting the hills in shades of gold and rust. Wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying the faint sound of distant thunder. Caleb Dawson leaned against the rail of his porch, a quiet figure in worn boots and a faded hat. At 45, he had grown used to silence. His small ranch stretched far in every direction, a patch of land he'd worked alone since his parents passed away years ago. He wasn't known for speaking much, nor for leaving his property unless he had to. Folks in town said the rancher kept more company with his cattle than with people, and they were right. Every morning, Caleb rose before dawn. The rooster's call and the creak of the barn door were his only greetings. He'd feed the horses, check the fences, fix whatever the wind had broken overnight. His dog, an old brown shepherd named Scout, followed him everywhere, loyal, silent, and tired, much like his owner. When the day's work was done, Caleb sat by the fire with his supper, sometimes staring at the flames long after the food was gone. He didn't write letters. He didn't visit town unless he needed supplies. He didn't celebrate his birthdays. Life had become a steady rhythm, one he didn't question. Some men feared loneliness, but for Caleb it had become his way of surviving. The world outside was changing fast. Trains, telegraphs, new towns springing up everywhere. But here, time seemed to stand still. He liked it that way, or so he told himself. That evening the air felt different, heavy. The horizon darkened with rolling clouds, and a strange stillness settled over the land. Caleb looked up, squinting at the sky. He could tell by the color of the clouds that the storm would be strong. He tied down the stable doors, checked on the horses, and stacked more firewood by the hearth. Scout barked once, uneasy. "Easy, boy," Caleb said, patting the dog's head. Just thunder. The storm hit soon after nightfall. Rain came down in thick sheets, turning the dirt road into rivers of mud. Lightning flashed across the plains, followed by the deep growl of thunder. The wind howled through the cracks of the cabin walls. Caleb sat near the fire, coat draped over his shoulders, listening to the storm's rage. It wasn't unusual for weather like this. Autumn always brought sudden tempests, but there was something restless in the air tonight. He had just poured himself a cup of coffee when it happened. A knock on the door, loud, urgent. Caleb froze. No one ever came this far out at night. For a moment he thought he'd imagined it. But then came another knock. Harder this time, followed by a faint voice shouting something he couldn't make out. Scout growled low, tail stiff. Caleb set his cup down and walked to the door, hand hovering near the old rifle that leaned against the wall. "Who's there?" he called out over the storm. A woman's voice answered, trembling but clear. "Please, please help me." He opened the door, and for a heartbeat all he saw was rain, pouring sideways under the lantern's glow. Then a figure stumbled forward. A woman, soaked to the bone, her dress clinging to her like wet paper. Her hair was plastered to her face, and her hands shook violently as she held onto the doorframe. "Good Lord," Caleb muttered, pulling her inside. She nearly collapsed onto the floor. He closed the door behind her and turned the lock. "You'll catch your death out there," he said gruffly, though his voice softened as he looked at her. She was young, maybe early 30s, with refined features that didn't belong to the rough lands of the West. Her clothes were city-made, fine but torn by wind and mud. She shivered uncontrollably, her lips pale. "My wagon broke down." "Miles back," she said, trying to catch her breath. "The driver went for help, but that was hours ago. I was afraid." "Sit by the fire," Caleb interrupted, helping her to a chair. "Get warm." He took his mother's old shawl from the peg and draped it over her shoulders. The fabric smelled faintly of cedar. She looked up at him, startled by his quiet kindness. "Thank you," she whispered, holding the shawl close. Her teeth still chattered. Caleb poured her a cup of coffee, adding a spoon of sugar, something he rarely used but kept out of old habit. "Drink this," he said. "Name's Caleb Dawson." "You from town?" She shook her head. "No. I came from Kansas City. My name's Clara Whitmore. I was heading to teach at a new school in Miller's Creek. I must have taken the wrong road." Caleb frowned slightly. Miller's Creek was over 20 miles east. "That's quite a distance off your trail," he said. "Storm must have thrown you off." Clara gave a weak smile. "It did more than that." Her eyes darted to the window where lightning flashed again. "If you hadn't opened the door." He said nothing, just added another log to the fire. The crackling flames filled the silence between them. For a while, the only sounds were the storm and the hiss of wet clothes drying by the hearth. Clara slowly began to relax, her face warming in the glow. She looked around the cabin, the sturdy table, the iron stove, the old photographs hanging crookedly on the wall. Everything looked worn but well kept, touched by care and years of use. "You live here alone?" she asked quietly. "Been that way a long time," he said without looking up. "Don't you get lonely?" He gave a short shrug. "Got used to it." Something about his tone made her fall silent. She studied his face, strong, weathered, but kind. There was a deep calm in his eyes, the kind that comes from living too long without company. She felt a strange comfort there, like the storm outside couldn't reach her in this small cabin. As the night went on, Caleb made her a bowl of stew, thick and warm. Clara ate slowly, her hands still trembling a little. "You must think me foolish," she said at last. "Traveling alone in weather like this." Caleb shook his head. "No, it takes courage to travel these lands. You'll find no blame from me." His words surprised her. Most men she'd met were quick to scold or pity. But this man, this quiet rancher with calloused hands and steady eyes, treated her with respect she hadn't expected. When she finished eating, she looked toward the fire again. The storm was still raging outside, but she felt safe now. "Do you think my driver's all right?" she asked. "He'll be fine," Caleb replied. "If he's smart, he found shelter. Roads'll be better by morning." She nodded, though worry still lingered in her gaze. The light flickered across her face, softening the exhaustion in her features. Caleb caught himself watching her, not out of curiosity, but something quieter, something unfamiliar after so many years of solitude. The clock ticked slowly. Midnight came and went. The storm began to fade, its thunder growing distant. Clara's eyes grew heavy, her head nodding. "You can take the cot," Caleb said gently. "It's clean enough," she hesitated. "And you?" "I'll take the chair. Don't worry about me." Clara started to protest, but her exhaustion won. She rose unsteadily and followed him to the small side room. The cot was plain, but she smiled when she saw the extra blanket he'd laid out. "You're very kind, Mr. Dawson." He tipped his hat slightly. "Just doing what's right." As she settled in, the wind quieted. Caleb returned to the main room, stoked the fire once more, and sat in his chair. Scout curled up at his feet, sighing deeply. The house, for the first time in years, felt different. Alive. Through the half-open door, Caleb could hear her breathing, slow and steady. The soft sound filled the silence that used to feel so heavy. He leaned back, staring into the flickering flames, wondering what had brought a city woman all the way out here, and why. Even though she'd only arrived an hour ago, her presence already felt like something he'd been missing all his life. Outside, the last of the rain fell across the fields. The storm had passed, but something inside Caleb had begun to stir, something he couldn't name yet but could no longer ignore. Morning sunlight slipped through the cracks of the cabin walls, cutting thin lines of gold across the floor. The storm had passed, leaving behind the smell of wet earth and pine. Caleb Dawson opened the door and stepped out into the quiet dawn. The sky was pale blue now, the land washed clean by rain. Puddles shimmered like small mirrors, and the air carried the sound of birds shaking water from their wings. For a long moment he stood there, breathing it all in, the peace after the fury. Scout barked softly behind him, wagging his tail. Caleb turned and saw Clara standing at the doorway, wrapped in the old shawl he had given her the night before. Her hair was still damp, curling at the ends, and her face looked softer in the morning light. She looked out at the valley in wonder. "It's beautiful," she said quietly. Caleb nodded. "Storm always leaves the land clean, like it never happened." She stepped onto the porch, her boots sinking slightly into the wet wood. "I can't believe how far this place feels from everything," she murmured. "It's like the world forgot about it." "Maybe it did," Caleb said with a faint smile. "That's the way I like it." She turned toward him, studying the man who had saved her. His eyes were calm, his manner steady, but there was something unreadable behind that quiet. She wondered how long he had lived here without anyone to talk to. Inside, Caleb made breakfast, strong coffee, cornbread, and eggs from the hens out back. Clara offered to help, but he shook his head. "You're still warming up," he said. She smiled and sat at the table, watching as he moved about the small kitchen. Everything in his home had a place, neat and simple. There was a comfort in that order, a rhythm born of years of solitude. As they ate, she spoke of her journey, She told him about Kansas City, the busy streets, the children she taught at the old brick schoolhouse, the sound of trains running at all hours. Her eyes brightened as she described it, but there was a flicker of sadness too. "I thought coming west would be a new beginning," she said softly. "But when the storm hit, I thought, maybe I made a mistake." Caleb listened quietly, his fork resting on the plate. "Storms pass," he said simply. "Mistakes don't mean much if you survive them." She looked up, meeting his eyes, and for a moment neither spoke. The fire popped softly in the stove, and outside the wind moved through the grass. Hours passed as they cleaned up and checked the damage. The fence near the southern edge had fallen under the storm's weight, so Caleb saddled his horse to inspect it. To his surprise, Clara insisted on coming along. "I can't just sit inside all day," she said. "I need to be useful." He wanted to argue but saw the determination in her eyes and nodded. "All right, but keep close." The two walked the muddy path together, Scout trotting ahead, sniffing the ground. The air was cool and bright. The mountains to the west were capped with a thin line of snow. Clara lifted her dress slightly to keep it from the mud, laughing softly when her boots sank into the earth. Caleb caught himself glancing at her now and then, wondering when he had last heard a woman laugh out here. When they reached the broken fence, she held the posts while he hammered the rails back in place. "You work hard," she said between breaths. "Don't you ever take a rest?" "Rest don't feed the horses," he replied. But there was a glint of humor in his voice. By noon, the fence stood straight again. Clara's gloves were covered in mud, and a streak of dirt marked her cheek, but she looked proud. "There," she said, smiling. "Almost as good as new." "Almost," Caleb agreed. He looked at her with quiet admiration. She wasn't like the city women he'd met long ago, soft and frightened by the wilderness. There was strength in her, the kind that came from having faced life's troubles and kept walking. They rode back to the cabin, the sun high overhead. Clara talked as they went, about her childhood, about the students she missed, about how strange it felt to be so far from any street or bell tower. Caleb listened, speaking only when needed. He wasn't much of a talker, but somehow her voice filled the silence in a way that felt right. When they reached the porch, Clara stopped and looked out at the wide land. "I can see why you stayed," she said softly. "It's lonely, but it's honest. There's something pure about it." Caleb set the tools aside. "It's quiet. That's what matters," she smiled faintly. "And you like quiet." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Used to." For a heartbeat, neither said anything. Then she laughed lightly. "Well, I'll try not to disturb it too much until my driver comes back." The afternoon stretched on in peace. Caleb worked in the barn, mending harnesses, while Clara tidied the cabin, sweeping the floor and folding the blankets neatly. It had been years since anyone had cared enough to clean that old place, and it surprised him when he walked back in and saw how bright it looked. "Didn't have to do all that," he said. "I wanted to," she replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "A teacher can't sit idle. It feels wrong." He nodded, pretending to be annoyed but secretly grateful. She moved through the space like she belonged there, not as a guest, but as someone who understood what a home should feel like. As evening came, the sky burned orange, fading into violet. Caleb lit the lanterns, and the cabin filled with soft golden light. Clara sat by the window, sewing a tear in her sleeve. The peaceful rhythm of her stitching mixed with the gentle sounds of the night outside. "Mr. Dawson," she said after a while, "you must think me foolish for ending up here like this." He looked up from the logbook he was writing in. "I don't think that. I've always tried to plan everything," she said quietly. "I thought I knew where life was taking me. But last night when the wagon broke and the storm came, I realized how small I was. I thought I might die out there." Caleb set the pen down. "You didn't," he said firmly. "You're here. That's what matters," she smiled, a small, tired smile. "You say that like it's simple." He shrugged. "It is. Out here, you take life one storm at a time." Clara looked at him then, really looked, and saw the man behind those calm words. A man who had lived through more storms than he'd ever tell. She wanted to ask about his past, about why he lived alone, but something in his eyes told her not to press. Instead, she said softly, "You remind me of my father. He worked until his hands couldn't hold a hammer anymore. He said silence teaches a man who he truly is." Caleb chuckled faintly. "Smart man. For a long moment, they sat in comfortable silence. The firelight danced on the walls and the shadows moved slowly, like old memories drifting by. Clara's head nodded once, then again, her eyelids heavy. Caleb noticed and spoke gently. "You should rest." "Long day." She shook her head slightly. "Not yet. I don't want to sleep too soon. The quiet feels too strange." He understood that feeling well. The nights out here could stretch endlessly, filled with thoughts that had nowhere to go. So he stayed up with her, talking softly about simple things: the land, the horses, the changes in the weather. She told him about her students and how one little boy had brought her an apple every morning for a year. They laughed quietly, the kind of laughter that felt rare and easy. When she finally grew too tired to keep her eyes open, he rose and took the lamp to her room. She hesitated in the doorway. "Good night, Mr. Dawson," she said. "Good night, Miss Whitmore," she smiled faintly. "You can call me Clara if you like." He paused, then nodded once. "Good night, Clara." When the door closed, he stood there for a moment, listening to the wind outside and the steady tick of the clock. Scout lay at his feet, tail thumping softly. Caleb sat back down by the fire, looking into the flames. Something had changed in the house. It wasn't just the clean floor or the warm smell of stew lingering in the air. It was something deeper, a sense that for the first time in many years he wasn't alone. And though he didn't say it out loud, Caleb found himself hoping the road stayed muddy just a little longer. The next morning came soft and bright, the kind of light that makes the land look new again. A thin fog rested over the valley, curling around the fences and cattle. Caleb was already outside when the first rooster crowed. He liked to start early, before the world woke up, before the silence broke. But this time there was another sound, the faint hum of a woman's voice drifting from inside the cabin. Clara was humming an old tune while she stirred the pot on the stove. The melody was light and sweet, the kind of sound Caleb hadn't heard in years. He stood by the doorway for a moment, listening quietly, not wanting to disturb her. Scout wagged his tail beside him, as if even the old dog could sense that something gentle had returned to their lonely home. When she noticed him standing there, she smiled shyly. "Good morning," she said. "I hope you don't mind. I thought I'd make breakfast this time." He tipped his hat slightly. "You didn't have to. I wanted to," she said. "It's the least I can do after you took me in." He stepped closer, the smell of cornbread and coffee filling the air. "Smells better than what I usually make." She laughed softly. "That doesn't surprise me." They ate together at the small wooden table, sunlight pouring through the window. Clara talked about the school she was supposed to work at in Miller's Creek, about how she had dreamed of teaching children who'd never seen a city classroom before. "I wanted to do something good," she said. "Something that matters." "You already have," Caleb said quietly, surprising himself. She looked up, curious. "How?" He didn't answer right away. He just looked at her across the table, her hair catching the light, her smile soft but strong. "You brought life into this house again," he said finally. "Been a long time since I heard laughter here." Clara lowered her gaze, touched by the words. She didn't reply, but her eyes shimmered slightly. After breakfast, Caleb hitched his wagon and told her he needed to check the upper pasture for damage from the storm. Clara offered to come along. "You'll need help," she said. "Two pairs of hands are better than one." He tried to argue but gave up. "All right," he said, "but stay close. The ground's still slick." They rode together through the open land. The horses' hooves splashed through puddles as the morning mist lifted. The land stretched endlessly around them, rolling hills, tall grass waving like an ocean of green. Clara couldn't take her eyes off it. "I've never seen anything so wide and empty," she said softly. "Empty's just another word for peaceful," Caleb replied. The ride took most of the morning. They repaired a few broken rails, checked the water troughs, and cleared branches from the creek path. Clara worked hard without complaint, her dress streaked with dirt, her gloves worn thin. Caleb found himself watching her more than once, not out of curiosity but respect. She wasn't afraid of hard work, and that meant something to him. When the sun climbed high, they stopped by the creek for rest. Clara knelt beside the water, cupping her hands and splashing her face. Caleb sat nearby, pulling off his hat to let the breeze cool his brow. "It's quiet here," she said after a while. "Peaceful," he nodded. "That's why I stay." "Don't you ever want to see what's beyond the valley?" He thought for a long time before answering. "Used to," he said. "I was young then. Thought there was something better somewhere else." But I learned the world doesn't get kinder the farther you travel. She looked at him thoughtfully. So you stopped looking? He smiled faintly. Guess I did. Clara let her fingers trail through the cool water, watching ripples form and fade. Sometimes I think people stop looking because they're afraid to be disappointed, she said. But maybe it's not about finding something better. Maybe it's about finding something that feels right. Caleb didn't respond. He just stared at the creek, her words stirring something deep inside him. They returned to the ranch by late afternoon, the sky turning soft and pink. The air was warm, filled with the smell of sage and dust. Clara went to feed the chickens while Caleb checked the horses. She worked quietly, humming again, her voice floating through the yard. Caleb paused mid-task, listening. It felt strange, how natural her presence had become in such a short time. That evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, they sat together on the porch. The horizon burned orange, fading to purple. Crickets began to sing. Clara wrapped the shawl around her shoulders, looking out at the endless stretch of land. Do you ever get tired of being alone out here? She asked softly. Caleb leaned back in his chair. Used to, not anymore. Why not? He glanced at her, his eyes reflecting the fading light. Because being alone's easier than losing someone again. Clara turned to him slowly. You've lost someone? He nodded once. My parents. A long time ago. And someone I cared for once. She left for the city. Said the ranch was too quiet for her. Clara looked down, her fingers tightening around the shawl. I'm sorry. Don't be, he said. Wasn't meant to be. Some folks aren't built for stillness. She hesitated before replying. And what about you, Mr. Dawson? Are you built for stillness? He chuckled quietly. Maybe I thought I was. The silence that followed wasn't empty this time. It was gentle, comfortable. The stars began to appear one by one. The cool night air carried the faint smell of rain still clinging to the earth. Clara leaned her elbows on the railing, staring up at the sky. You can see every star out here, she whispered. Back home, the lights hide them. Caleb nodded. City forgets the sky's even there, she smiled faintly. Maybe that's why I left. The firelight from inside flickered against the walls of the cabin. Clara turned to him. You said you don't go to town much. Why? Town's noisy, he said simply. Too many people talking about nothing that matters. Out here I know what's real. Wind, rain, land. That's enough. She studied him for a moment. You sound like a man who stopped expecting more from life. He met her gaze. Maybe I stopped expecting, but I didn't stop living. Something about that made her smile. You're wiser than you think, Mr. Dawson. He shook his head. Just older. The night deepened and the air grew cool. A coyote howled somewhere in the distance, its cry echoing across the valley. Clara shivered slightly, and Caleb rose, fetching another blanket from inside. He handed it to her without a word. She looked up at him and whispered, Thank you. When she smiled, something inside him shifted again. Small, almost unnoticeable, but real. They sat there a long time, watching the stars. Caleb told her stories of the land, how the river once overflowed and carried off half his fence, how a wild Mustang had wandered onto his ranch one winter and refused to leave. Clara listened with quiet fascination, asking questions, laughing softly at his rare bits of humor. At one point she said, I can't remember the last time I felt this calm. It's strange. I was terrified when I knocked on your door, and now? Now? He asked. Now it feels like I've been here forever. He looked at her then, really looked, and saw something in her eyes he hadn't seen before. Not fear, not pity, but peace. When she finally stood to go inside, she paused at the doorway. Good night, Caleb, she said softly. He froze for half a second, hearing his name in her voice. It sounded different, gentle, familiar. Good night, Clara, he replied. She smiled, then disappeared into the warm glow of the cabin. Caleb stayed outside a while longer, his hat resting on his knee. The stars shimmered above, bright and endless. Scout lay at his feet, eyes half closed. For the first time in many years, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt like company. He glanced toward the window, where Clara's shadow moved behind the curtain. He didn't know how long she'd stay or what tomorrow would bring. But for now, it didn't matter. The road to town was still washed out. The world could wait. Inside that small cabin in the middle of the valley, something had begun, quiet and slow, like the first rays of sunrise touching a cold land. Caleb didn't name it. He just let it be. And for the first time since his youth, he didn't dread the coming dawn. The days passed quietly after that night. The storm was long gone and the land had turned green again. The air carried the smell of wet grass and wildflowers, and the hills glowed gold under the warm sun. For Caleb, every morning began the same way, feeding the horses, checking the fences, and working in the barn. But it no longer felt the same. There was laughter now, soft footsteps on the porch, the sound of Clara's voice drifting through the open window. She stayed longer than either of them expected. Her driver hadn't returned, and the road to town was still thick with mud. Each day she said she would leave tomorrow, but tomorrow never came. Caleb didn't ask why. Maybe he didn't want to know. Maybe he just liked the sound of her moving about his quiet home. Clara helped wherever she could. She cooked meals, mended old clothes, and tended to the small garden behind the cabin. She even started teaching Caleb how to read better. One evening, she found an old book tucked away in a wooden chest, a collection of stories his mother used to read. She sat near the fire and read aloud while Caleb listened, his rough hands resting on his knees. The words, soft and warm, filled the room like music. "You've got a voice made for reading," Caleb said once, smiling faintly. Clara laughed. "And you've got ears that actually listen. Most men back in Kansas City would be asleep by now." "Guess I'm different," he replied quietly. That was true. He was different. The world beyond the valley moved fast. Trains, cities, crowds, noise. But here time slowed down. Each sunrise and sunset felt like it belonged to them alone. One afternoon, while Caleb worked near the barn, Clara came outside carrying a basket of laundry. The breeze caught her hair and she brushed it from her face, smiling. Caleb stopped hammering the broken rail and just watched for a moment. He didn't realize he was smiling too until she caught him staring. "What?" she asked playfully. "Nothing," he said quickly, turning back to his work. She grinned. "You're a terrible liar," he chuckled softly. Maybe. It was a small moment, but it stayed with him. He had spent half his life thinking his heart was a dead thing, buried with time and silence. But now it stirred again, quietly, like something remembering how to breathe. That night they ate together by lamplight. The wind was soft, the sky full of stars. Clara told him about her mother, who used to sit by the window sewing while humming old church songs. Caleb told her about his father, a quiet man who taught him how to ride, how to plant, and how to face the world without fear. They shared pieces of their lives, simple and true, as if the world outside had disappeared. But the world hadn't disappeared. It was just waiting. The next morning, as Clara swept the porch, she heard a sound, the rumble of wheels on the distant road. She looked up, her heart leaping. A wagon was coming down the trail, a figure on the seat waving his hat. It was her driver, Mr. Dawson, she called. "He's back." Caleb stepped out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked toward the road and nodded slowly. The driver climbed down, greeting Clara with relief. "Miss Whitmore, thank the Lord you're safe. I've been searching every road for 2 days. Got caught near the ridge when the bridge washed out." "I'm fine," she said, smiling. "Mr. Dawson took good care of me." The driver nodded to Caleb respectfully. "Much obliged, sir. The wagon's fixed now. We can leave after noon if the road holds." Clara's smile faded just a little. "Afternoon?" "Yes, ma'am. Best travel while the sun's high." Caleb stood quietly beside the fence, saying nothing. The air between them grew heavy. Clara turned to him, her eyes uncertain. I suppose I'll gather my things," she said softly. He nodded once. "All right." Inside the cabin, she packed slowly. Her hands shook as she folded the shawl he had given her. The small room that had felt like home for a handful of days now seemed smaller, emptier. Every sound, the creak of the floorboards, the wind brushing against the window, seemed to whisper goodbye. Caleb waited outside, pretending to busy himself with the horses. Scout sat beside him, tail still. When Clara finally came out, she carried only one small suitcase. Her hat was pulled low, her expression unreadable. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything." "For your kindness," he nodded again. "You don't have to thank me." "I do," she said, stepping closer. "You opened your home to a stranger. You saved me that night." He looked at her then, his eyes calm but sad. Wasn't anything special. Just the right thing to do. She smiled faintly, but her eyes shimmered. You always say things so simply. Maybe that's what I'll miss the most, the driver called from the wagon. Ready when you are, miss. She turned toward the road, then paused. For a moment, it looked like she wanted to say something more, but no words came. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out the old shawl. She held it out to him. Here, she said softly, so you don't forget warmth. Caleb stared at it for a long moment before taking it. I won't. Their hands brushed lightly. It was the smallest touch, but it said more than either of them could find the courage to speak aloud. Then she climbed into the wagon. Caleb stepped back, his hat low over his eyes. The wheels creaked, the horses snorted, and the wagon began to move. Clara looked back once, the cabin shrinking behind her, the figure of the rancher standing still beside the fence. His dog sat beside him, ears down, as if it too knew something was ending. The road stretched long and straight toward the horizon. The land looked endless, but to Clara it suddenly felt narrow, like every mile was pulling her farther from something she didn't want to leave. She turned once more, but the cabin was gone, hidden behind the curve of the hill. Caleb stood there long after the wagon disappeared. The wind picked up, tugging at the edges of his coat. He held the shawl tightly in one hand, his thumb brushing the fabric. The scent of lavender still clung to it. The ranch was quiet again. The silence he had once called peace now felt heavy, almost cruel. That evening, he sat on the porch staring at the road. Scout lay at his feet, restless. Inside, the fire burned low. The chair across from his sat empty, the sound of her voice gone. He tried to tell himself it didn't matter, that life would return to what it was. But when the night deepened and the stars filled the sky, he realized the truth. The quiet no longer felt like home. The next few days passed in slow motion. Caleb worked as always, feeding, mending, fixing. But the air felt different. Meals were silent. Even Scout seemed to wait by the door each evening, as if expecting her to return. Caleb caught himself looking toward the horizon whenever he heard wagon wheels or voices on the wind. But no one came. One night, while repairing a saddle, he found something tucked inside the blanket she had used, a small folded note. His rough hands trembled slightly as he opened it. Her handwriting was neat, careful. You reminded me that kindness still lives in this world. You gave me safety when I had nothing. I won't forget you, Mr. Dawson, wherever I go. This place will stay with me. There was no signature, only the faint scent of lavender. Caleb closed the note and sat there for a long time, the firelight flickering across his face. He felt something inside him shift, a mix of sadness and strange hope. Maybe this wasn't an ending. Maybe it was the beginning of something he didn't understand yet. The following morning, he rose before dawn, as he always did. The land was quiet, wrapped in mist. He went about his chores, the rhythm steady but different. Each sound, and the creak of the gate, the whistle of the wind, reminded him of her voice. When he looked toward the hills, the road was still empty. But for the first time in many years, Caleb didn't see emptiness. He saw a path, one that led somewhere new. He didn't know if he would ever see Clara again. But deep down, he felt something he hadn't felt since his youth, a small, steady warmth, the kind that stayed long after the fire burned low. He placed the shawl carefully over the chair by the window, where the light touched it every morning. And though he didn't speak a word, Scout wagged his tail softly as if he understood. For the first time in a long, lonely life, Caleb Dawson hoped the silence might not last forever. Weeks passed after the wagon disappeared down the dusty road. The days at the ranch fell back into their old rhythm. Quiet mornings, long hours of work, and evenings spent by the fire. But the silence was not the same anymore. Every sound seemed louder now. The creak of the chair, the wind against the windows, even the sound of his boots on the porch, all reminded Caleb of the presence that was gone. He tried to tell himself that life was returning to normal. But as each dawn came, he found the emptiness harder to ignore. The chair across the table stayed empty. The small flower she had picked still sat in a cup by the window, dried and fragile. The shawl she had left hung on the back of the rocking chair, catching the soft light every morning. Caleb worked harder than ever, fixing fences that didn't need fixing, polishing tools already clean. It gave his hands something to do when his mind wandered. Yet no matter how much work he found, her voice still lingered in his memory. That soft laugh, the way she'd hum while stirring stew or reading aloud by the fire. Scout seemed to notice too. The old dog spent more time sitting by the road, his eyes fixed on the horizon as if waiting. Some evenings Caleb would sit beside him, both of them quiet, listening to the wind roll over the hills. One evening, while the sun was setting behind the ridge, Caleb stood on the porch looking west. The sky burned orange, fading to purple and blue. He thought of how she had looked under that same sky, her hair catching the light, her eyes full of wonder. He sighed, turned, and went inside. That night he sat by the fire reading one of the books she had left open. The pages smelled faintly of her perfume. His eyes blurred after a while, not from the words, but from the ache behind them. He closed the book and whispered into the quiet, "You should have stayed." The wind rattled the window softly as if answering. Days turned into weeks, and the valley began to change with the season. The grass grew taller, the trees fuller. The river that had overflowed during the storm now ran clear again. The road, once thick with mud, was hard and dry. Still no wagon came. Caleb had almost convinced himself she would never return. Then one morning in late spring, Scout barked from the porch. Caleb looked up from the stable, frowning. The old dog never barked without reason. He wiped his hands and stepped outside. Down the road, far off, a wagon was coming. The wheels kicked up dust and the sun glinted off the polished wood. Caleb's heart quickened, though he told himself it was nothing. Maybe a trader, maybe a lost traveler. But as the wagon drew closer, his breath caught. Sitting on the seat, holding the reins, was a woman in a blue dress. Her hair was tied back, her posture straight, confident. Even from a distance, he knew. He didn't move at first. He just stood there, his hand tightening on the railing as the wagon rolled closer and came to a stop before the cabin. Clara climbed down slowly, her boots touching the ground with a soft thud. She looked different, stronger somehow, but her smile was the same. "Hello, Mr. Dawson," she said. For a moment he couldn't speak. His voice seemed to have left him. "You came back," he finally said. "I did." She looked around, taking in the cabin, the land, the quiet hills. The school in Miller's Creek needed a teacher after all. But the town's full. There's no room to stay. Caleb's eyes softened. "So you came here," she nodded. "If you'll have me." He didn't hesitate. "You know you're always welcome." Her smile grew warmer. "Then I'll stay." Scout barked and ran up to her, tail wagging furiously. She knelt to pat his head, laughing as the dog licked her hand. "You remember me, don't you?" she said softly. "Good boy." Caleb watched her for a long moment, trying to believe she was really there. The sun shone on her face, and for the first time in months the cabin didn't look lonely anymore. They unloaded her small trunk and carried it inside. Clara walked through the cabin slowly, touching the things she remembered. The chair by the window, the shelf where she'd kept her books, the table where they'd shared breakfast. "It's just like I left it," she said. "I don't change much," he replied with a small smile. That evening they sat together again by the fire, as if no time had passed. She told him about her short stay in Miller's Creek, how she'd taught children for a few weeks, but the noise and crowd had felt wrong. "It wasn't home," she said simply. "It never felt right." Caleb looked at her across the table. "And this place does?" She met his eyes. "Yes, it always did." He didn't know what to say. He felt something tighten in his chest, something like relief mixed with disbelief. For so long he had thought the world would never send him another chance. But now here she was again, like a second sunrise after a long winter. Over the next days, the ranch felt alive again. Clara took to her old ways easily, feeding the chickens, tending the small garden, reading aloud in the evenings. She also began teaching some of the local children who lived on nearby farms. Their parents brought them once a week to learn their letters and numbers. The cabin echoed with laughter again, with the sound of learning and life. Caleb built her a small porch desk near the window so she could write her lessons in the afternoon light. She thanked him with a quiet smile that said more than words ever could. The townsfolk began to talk, the lonely rancher and the city teacher who had chosen the valley over the town. But neither of them cared for talk. They had found something steady in each other, something neither had been looking for but both needed deeply. One evening, after the children had gone home and the sun was setting, Clara stood outside watching the sky burn red and gold. Caleb came beside her, his hat in his hands. "It's strange," she said softly. "When I left, I thought I was going back to my life. But everything there felt empty. I realized home isn't where you come from. It's where you feel peace." He nodded slowly. And you feel that here? She turned toward him, her eyes warm. Yes, with you. He looked down at his hands, rough and weathered from years of work. You sure about that? This place isn't easy. It's quiet, hard, lonely at times. She smiled gently. It was lonely for you because you were alone. But you're not alone anymore. He didn't answer at first. Instead, he looked out over the valley, the land he had spent his whole life working, the hills that had watched him grow old in silence. Now for the first time, it all felt different. Alive. Finally, he said quietly, Then stay. Stay as long as you want. I intend to, she replied with a soft laugh. That night, the cabin glowed with warm light. The fire crackled, Scout snored softly near the hearth, and Clara sat by the window writing in her notebook. Caleb watched her for a moment before going to sit beside her. What are you writing? He asked. Just a letter, she said, smiling. To an old friend back east. I want to tell her that I've finally found peace. He nodded slowly. Good, you deserve it. She looked up at him, her expression kind. So do you, Caleb Dawson. The firelight danced between them, soft and golden. The world outside was quiet, but the quiet no longer felt heavy. It felt full. Months passed, and the valley turned green again. Together they built a new life, simple, honest, and filled with small joys. Some evenings they'd sit on the porch watching the sun go down, not needing words. Other times they'd share stories or laughter until the stars came out. The townsfolk still whispered about them, but Caleb no longer cared what anyone said. He had spent half his life living for the land and the silence. Now he lived for the sound of her voice, the sight of her smile, the warmth of her presence in that once lonely cabin. And every morning, when the first light touched the window, he would look at the shawl still hanging on the chair, a reminder of the storm that had brought her to his door, and smile. Because sometimes, life doesn't send blessings in grand ways. Sometimes it knocks quietly one stormy night, wearing a city dress and a trembling smile. And for Caleb Dawson, that knock had changed everything forever.